I want to start with a man named Caleb Rohn, because everything I'm about to lay out came from a box of his notes. And if I don't tell you who he was first, none of the rest of it will land right. Caleb wasn't a paranormal guy. That's the thing people get wrong when I describe him. He spent 31 years as a documents archivist, the last 19 of them at a theological library attached to a seminary in Dubuque, Iowa. His job, the actual job, was cataloging and preserving manuscripts. Patristic texts, mostly. Writings of the early church fathers, 2nd and 3rd and 4th century, the men who argued out what Christianity was going to be before anybody had decided. He could read Koine Greek, he could read Ge'ez, which is the old liturgical language of Ethiopia. And that detail matters more than you'd think, so hold on to it. He had a pension, a paid-off house, a wife named Marjorie who taught piano, and a workshop in the garage where he built birdhouses nobody asked for. He was, by every measure I can find, the least likely person on earth to end up where he ended up. He died in March of last year, heart in his sleep, 73 years old. And about 4 months after that, Marjorie called a man named Dale Hutchins, who is the person I actually got all of this from, and asked him to come take a look at Caleb's study, because she couldn't make sense of what was in it, and she didn't want to throw out something that mattered. Dale is the one I've spent the most time with. He's a retired county surveyor, lives outside Galena, and he knew Caleb for close to 40 years. They met through a Methodist men's group and stayed friends long after Dale stopped going to church, and Caleb, in his quiet way, started taking it more seriously than anyone around him realized. Dale is not a believer. I want to be clear about that, because it changes how you hear him. He's a measurements guy. He spent his career establishing property lines, and he'll tell you that the whole job is just deciding what's true and being willing to defend it with a paper trail. When he talks about Caleb's notes, he doesn't talk like a man who's been converted to anything. He talks like a man who got handed a survey that doesn't close, where the lines don't meet back up at the start, and it's been bothering him ever since. So that's the frame. A dead archivist, a skeptical surveyor, and a box. I've had the contents of that box described to me in detail across, I think, 6 long conversations now, and I've held photographs of maybe 40 of the individual documents. I'm going to walk you through what's in it, and I'll tell you up front, I don't know what to do with all of it. Some of it I think I can explain, some of it I can't. I'm going to try to be honest with you about which is which. Here's where it starts. Caleb's interest, the one that ate the last 11 years of his life, did not begin with anything strange. It began with a footnote. In 2013, the seminary library acquired a small collection of correspondence and working papers from the estate of a deceased professor of early church history. Routine acquisition. Caleb's job was to catalog it, and buried in that collection was a partial draft of an unpublished paper, never finished, dealing with the reception history of the Book of Enoch in the early church. I should stop and explain what the Book of Enoch is, because most people have heard the name, and almost nobody knows the actual situation. And the actual situation is genuinely strange before you add a single dogman to it. The Book of Enoch, specifically the section scholars call First Enoch, is an ancient Jewish text. We can date portions of it, with real confidence, to the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ. That's not fringe dating, that's the mainstream scholarly consensus, and the reason we can be that confident is that fragments of it in Aramaic were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, multiple copies. It was a text that mattered to the community that hid those scrolls. So, we're talking about a book that is older than a great deal of what ended up in the Standard Bible. The first 36 chapters of it are called the Book of the Watchers. And the Book of the Watchers tells a story that the canonical book of Genesis only gestures at in 4 extremely compressed verses. Genesis chapter 6 mentions, almost in passing, the sons of God coming down and taking human wives. And it mentions the offspring of that union, and it uses a Hebrew word, Nephilim, which gets translated into English Bibles, usually as giants. And then Genesis basically drops the subject and moves on to Noah and the flood. Enoch does not drop the subject. Enoch tells the whole thing. In Enoch, the sons of God are a specific group of angelic beings called the Watchers, 200 of them. And they have a leader, and they descend onto the earth. The text even specifies the mountain. And they take human wives, and the children of those unions are the Nephilim, who in Enoch are described not just as giants, but as a catastrophe. They consume everything, and the Watchers crucially teach humanity things. Forbidden things, metalworking and weapons, cosmetics, astrology, the cutting of roots, what we'd call pharmacology. The whole disaster of the flood, in the logic of Enoch, is God's response to this contamination. The Nephilim aren't just big people, they're a category error. They're a bloodline that should not exist, the product of two kinds of being that were never supposed to mix. Now, here is the part that Caleb already knew, that any seminary archivist knows, and that the unfinished footnote in that 2013 acquisition was circling. The Book of Enoch was, for the first 2 or 3 centuries of Christianity, not fringe. It was close to Scripture. The Epistle of Jude, which is in everybody's New Testament right now, directly quotes the Book of Enoch and names Enoch as a prophet. That is not in dispute. It's right there. Early and influential church writers, Tertullian most famously, defended the Book of Enoch and treated it as genuine and authoritative. Tertullian wrote, in plain terms, that he was aware some people rejected the book, and he argued they were wrong to. And then, over the course of the 4th and 5th centuries, it went away. It was pushed out. It did not make the canon in the West. It survived as scripture in exactly one place on earth, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, which is the reason the only complete surviving text of 1st Enoch is in Ge'ez, that old Ethiopian language I told you to remember. The Latin West lost it so completely that European scholars effectively forgot the full text existed, until a Scottish traveler brought copies back from Ethiopia in the 1770s. So, the historical fact, the boring, footnotable, completely mainstream fact that started Caleb Rohn down this road is this. There was a detailed ancient account of non-human beings interbreeding with humans and producing a monstrous hybrid bloodline. That account was treated as scripture by the earliest Christians, and then the institutional church spent 2 centuries quietly removing it from the canon. That's not a conspiracy theory. That's just church history. You can read it in any seminary. Caleb had read it 100 times. What changed, what turned a professional curiosity into the thing that consumed him, was a question Dale says Caleb asked him over coffee sometime in 2014. Dale remembers it because of how out of character it was. Caleb asked him, if you were going to remove a true thing from the historical record, not a false thing, a true one, how would you do it? Dale, being a surveyor, said you'd attack the documentation. You'd dispute the source. You'd reclassify it. You wouldn't say it's a lie. You'd say it's unreliable, and then you'd let time do the rest. Caleb apparently nodded for a long while and then said, that's exactly what they did, and I've never once stopped to ask why it mattered so much to them. That's the beginning. A man whose entire profession was the preservation of documents started to wonder, late in his life, whether the most important thing in his field was something that had been deliberately not preserved. For a few years after that, as far as Dale knows, it stayed academic. Caleb read. He requested interlibrary loans. He corresponded with 2 or 3 other scholars. The box has letters, polite, dense, careful letters about textual transmission and canon formation. If it had stayed there, there'd be no story. It'd just be a hobby a retired man had. The turn, the actual turn, happened in 2018, and it happened because of a completely unrelated thing, which is that Caleb's grandson got him a tablet computer and showed him how to use the internet for something other than email. I want to be careful here, because this is the seam in the whole story, where it goes from respectable to the thing I can't tell people at dinner, and I don't want to slide across that seam without you noticing. Caleb Rohn, at 70 years old, with a head full of 4th century canon law, discovered that there is an entire world of people online documenting encounters with a creature they call DOGMAN. If you don't know the DOGMAN material, here's the shape of it, and I'm going to describe it the way the reports describe it, not the way I'd describe it if I were trying to sell you on it. The modern DOGMAN phenomenon, as a named thing, is usually traced to Michigan, to a song a radio DJ recorded as an April Fool's joke in 1987, of all things. And the song unexpectedly generated a flood of calls from listeners who said the joke wasn't a joke to them, that they'd seen the thing. Since then it's spread, or the reports have spread, across the upper Midwest, the Appalachians, the Pacific Northwest, and it's bled into the older, broader category that people call Bigfoot and cryptid sightings generally. But the Dogman reports have a consistent profile, and the consistency is the part that got Caleb. The witnesses describe a creature that is bipedal, that walks upright on two legs, but is unmistakably canine in the head and face. A long muzzle, upright, pointed ears. It's tall. The reports cluster around 7 feet, sometimes more. It's covered in dark, coarse fur. It's heavily muscled in a way witnesses describe as wrong, as not matching the proportions of any animal they know. And over, in report after report logged by people who have never spoken to each other, the witnesses fixate on the eyes. They say the eyes are intelligent. They say the eyes are aware. They use the word knowing, a creature that looks at you and is clearly, unmistakably thinking. Caleb did not read these reports as a believer. This is the thing Dale is most insistent that I get right. Caleb read them the way he read a 4th century manuscript, as a documents man. And what a documents man does with a body of testimony is, he looks at the transmission. He asks, are these accounts dependent on each other or independent? Because 1,000 copies of one lie is still one lie. But 100 independent witnesses describing the same specific thing is a different kind of problem. And Caleb's professional judgment, written out in his own hand in a document Dale photographed for me, was that a meaningful subset of the Dogman accounts showed what he called, and I'm quoting his note here, the markers of independent attestation, witnesses who had no plausible contact with each other, in different decades, in different states, who included the same incidental details, not the dramatic details, the incidental ones, the boring ones. He noted that independent witnesses kept mentioning a smell, and kept describing it the same way, as something rotten layered under something else. And he noted that they kept describing the creature as standing still for an unnaturally long time before moving. And he noted, this is the one that he underlined, that witnesses repeatedly said the creature did not behave like a predator, that it watched them and assessed them and then chose to leave. In the margin next to that, in pencil, Caleb had written 4 words. Dale read them to me over the phone and then, because I didn't believe him, sent me the photograph. The 4 words are, they are not hunting. And underneath that, smaller, watchers do not hunt, watchers watch. That's the hinge of the entire box. That's the moment a retired archivist's 2 unrelated obsessions, an expurgated ancient text and a body of modern wilderness testimony, became, in his mind, one single thing. Now I want to slow all the way down, because if I just race ahead from here, it's going to sound like the ravings of a man who lost the thread late in life, and I genuinely do not think that's what this is. So, let me lay out the actual argument Caleb built, the way he built it, because the argument is more careful than you're expecting. Caleb's claim was not, Dogman is a Nephilim. He was too precise a thinker for something that loose. His claim, as I reconstruct it from probably 200 pages of notes, had 3 parts, and he kept them separate. The first part was about the text itself. Caleb argued that the Book of the Watchers, the Enochic material, contains physical descriptions of the offspring of the Watchers that do not actually match the simple word giant. He had gone back to the Ge'ez, and to the Aramaic Qumran fragments where they survive, and to the Greek, and he had built a case that the tradition was messier and stranger than the tidy English word giants suggests. He pointed out correctly that the Enochic and related traditions describe the offspring of the Watchers as monstrous and as multiple in kind. There's a related ancient text, the Book of Giants, also found at Qumran, also part of this same body of literature, and it preserves fragments that name individual giants and describe dream visions and a generally chaotic, hybrid, bestial population. Caleb's point was modest and, I think, defensible. The ancient tradition did not describe one clean category of big humans. It described a contamination event that produced a range of wrong things. He believed the early church flattened that, and that giants was the flattening. The second part of Caleb's argument was about the suppression, and this is the part where Caleb was on the firmest possible ground. Because he wasn't speculating, he was doing his actual job. He had assembled a genuine source timeline of how the Book of Enoch was removed from the Western canon, and the timeline is worth walking through slowly, because the speed of it is the thing that gets lost when people summarize it. It did not happen in a single dramatic moment. There was no council where a man stood up and said, "Burn the Book of Enoch." It happened the way Dale, the surveyor, said you would erase a true thing, gradually, through reclassification, through the steady downgrading of a source. In the earliest period, the late 1st and 2nd centuries, the Book of Enoch was simply in the air of Christianity. The Epistle of Jude, written into the New Testament itself, quotes it directly and calls Enoch a prophet, presents the quotation the way you present Scripture, as settled and authoritative. The Epistle of Barnabas, an early and widely respected Christian text, treats Enoch as Scripture too. Several of the earliest and most influential Christian writers, men whose names anyone who studies the period knows, drew on the Watcher's material without apology, as a true account of why the world was the way it was. Tertullian, writing around the year 200, is the clearest case, because Tertullian actually addresses the controversy head-on. He records that some people in his own day were already rejecting the Book of Enoch, and he argues against them by name, defending the book's authority, and offering reasons it should be kept. Caleb's note on Tertullian was simple and pointed. Tertullian's defense proves the attack had already begun. You do not defend a book nobody is attacking. By the year 200, the removal was underway, and a serious man felt he had to stand in front of it. Then the 3rd and 4th centuries, and the slow turn. Influential figures grew uneasy. The unease, and Caleb documented this from the sources rather than inventing it, centered specifically and repeatedly on the Watchers, on the angels. The notion that angelic beings could descend, could take physical form, could father children on human women, was judged by a growing number of churchmen to be theologically intolerable. It degraded the angelic nature. It made spirit into something that could be corrupted by flesh. And so, the pressure built not to argue that the Book of Enoch was historically false, but to find a way to read the dangerous verses of Genesis 6 so that the angels disappeared from them entirely, and they found one. The sons of God who take human wives in Genesis 6 were reinterpreted increasingly and then dominantly as the human descendants of Seth, a righteous human line, marrying into the corrupt human descendants of Cain. No angels, no descent, no hybrids, no Watchers. A purely human story about good families and bad families intermarrying. By the time Augustine wrote, in the early 5th century, in the great work where he lays out the whole sweep of sacred history, the Sethite reading is presented as the sensible one, and the Book of Enoch is held at arm's length. Its antiquity acknowledged, its authority denied, the reason given being precisely that it is too old and too strange to be trusted, that it had been handed down too far from its source to be relied upon. The book that the Qumran community had copied and treasured, the book Jude had quoted as prophecy, was now, officially, too old to believe. Caleb had set Augustine's argument and Tertullian's argument side by side on a single page, 2 centuries apart, and the contrast is the entire point. Tertullian, the earlier man, closer to the source, defends the book. Augustine, the later man, further downstream, with a church now far more invested in a tidy and total account of reality, sets it aside. Caleb's note between the 2 columns read, "Nothing was discovered in the years between these 2 men that made Enoch less true. No evidence arrived. What changed was not the book. What changed was how much the church now had to lose if the book were believed." And here's the thing Dale and I both keep coming back to. The arguments they used to push the Book of Enoch out were not, "This book is full of lies." That's not what they said. The objection that did the most damage was an objection about the Watcher's story specifically. They argued that the idea of angels physically interbreeding with women was theologically intolerable, that it degraded the angelic nature, and that therefore the sons of God in Genesis 6 had to be reinterpreted as something safer. Caleb's note on this is one of the calmest, and somehow one of the most unsettling things in the entire box. He wrote, "They did not reject Enoch because they decided it was false. They rejected it because they decided it could not be allowed to be true. Those are different acts. The first is scholarship. The second is containment." That word again. Containment. It's all over the box. He used it constantly. The third part of Caleb's argument was the one I have the hardest time with, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. The third part was that the thing the Book of the Watchers describes did not end with the flood, and that the church fathers knew it didn't end, and that the modern wilderness sightings, the Dogman accounts specifically, are the same phenomenon, still present, still being witnessed, and still, in his words, being contained, not by steel, but by disbelief. He thought the loss of the Book of Enoch was itself the containment mechanism, that if you take away people's framework for understanding a thing, the thing becomes invisible even when it's standing in front of them. A person in the year 300 who saw an upright, intelligent, fur-covered being in the forest had a category for it. They had a name and a scripture and a whole cosmology that told them what they were looking at. A person in the year 2000 who sees the exact same thing has no category, so they file it under, "I must be losing my mind," and they never tell anyone, and the sighting evaporates. Caleb's claim was that the disappearance of the Book of Enoch didn't make the Watcher's bloodline go away. It just made it unspeakable. And unspeakable, for a phenomenon, is almost as good as gone. I told you I'd be honest about which parts I can explain and which I can't. The first two parts of Caleb's argument I can mostly follow as ordinary, if unusually intense scholarship. The dates are real. The suppression is real. The theological motive for the suppression is real and is openly discussed in the academic literature. A careful, slightly obsessive retired archivist could absolutely have assembled all of that, and it would all check out. And none of it would require a single monster. It's the third part where I lose my footing. And I'd be content to tell you that the third part is just where a good man's reasoning finally slipped, except that the box does not let me leave it there. Because the box is not only argument. The box also has the field notes, and the field notes are the reason I'm sitting here telling you any of this instead of leaving it in Marjorie Roan's attic, where it would have been a great deal more comfortable for everyone. Sometime in 2019, Caleb stopped only reading. He started corresponding with witnesses directly. He found them through the online reporting databases, the ones where sightings get logged, and he did something that, as far as Dale and I can tell, almost nobody in that world does. He treated the witnesses like sources to be interviewed properly. He wrote to them. He asked careful, non-leading questions. He asked the same set of questions to people who didn't know each other so he could compare answers. He was, essentially, running the same evidentiary process on living witnesses that he'd spent his career running on dead manuscripts. He was checking for independent attestation. The box has the results. Caleb organized his witness correspondence into folders, and he gave the folders names, and the names are not dramatic. They're just geographic. There's a folder labeled with a county in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. There's one for a stretch of southeastern Ohio. There's one for a section of north-central Pennsylvania. There's one for a part of the Wisconsin Northwoods. And there's a thin one, the thinnest, the one Dale didn't even mention to me until our fourth conversation, labeled with a county in northeastern Iowa, which is to say, labeled with a place about 40 minutes from Caleb Roan's own house. I'm going to take you through some of what's in those folders. And then I'm going to tell you what's in the Iowa one, because the Iowa one is where this stops being a story about a book. I want to pause here for now and pick it back up in a moment, because the next part needs a clear head, and so does mine. What I've told you so far is, more or less, the respectable half. A man, a suppressed text, a body of testimony, and an argument connecting them. You could walk away right now, and the worst you'd have to say is that a learned man spent his retirement on an eccentric thesis. And there are worse ways to spend a retirement. But the box has a second half. And once I tell you the second half, you don't get to keep the comfortable version. So, take a breath. I had to. All right. The witness folders. Let me start with the Michigan one, because it's the fullest, and because it's the one where Caleb's method shows the clearest. Caleb had corresponded with, by my count from the folder, 11 separate witnesses across Michigan's Upper Peninsula, with sightings ranging in date from 1978 to 2019. He had a standard set of questions, and he was disciplined about not leading. He never used the word dogman in an initial letter. He'd write and say he was a researcher collecting accounts of unusual wildlife encounters, and he'd ask the witness to describe, in their own words, what they saw, where, when, and what they did afterward. Only in later letters, once he had their unprompted account, would he ask his more specific follow-ups, and the unprompted accounts converged. That's the whole point of the folder, and Caleb had even written a one-page summary clipped to the front of it, tabulating the convergences like a man tallying a survey. Of the 11 Michigan witnesses, 9 independently described the creature as standing upright. 10 described a canine or wolf-like head. 8, without being asked anything about it, mentioned a smell, and Caleb had noted that the smell descriptions clustered. People reached for the same comparison, something dead, and then under the something dead, something they couldn't place, something one witness called hot, and another called like a struck match, and a third just called wrong. Caleb had bracketed those three phrases together in the margin. 7 of the 11, and this is the convergence Caleb cared about most, described the creature holding completely still, not crouched to spring, not stalking, standing, fully upright, motionless. For a length of time, the witnesses described as unbearable. One man, a logger, sighting from 1994, told Caleb the thing stood so still for so long that he'd genuinely convinced himself he was looking at a stump or a shadow, right up until it turned its head. And 6 of the 11 said some version of the thing that Caleb had underlined twice on the summary sheet. They said it could have gotten me. They said it was close enough, fast enough, strong enough, and it didn't. It looked at them, and then it left. The logger's exact words, which Caleb had copied out, were, "It made up its mind about me. I've thought about that for 20 years. It looked at me, and it decided something, and then it walked off. And whatever it decided, I passed." Now, a skeptic, and I want you to hear me being the skeptic for a second, a skeptic says, of course the accounts converge. These people aren't independent at all. They all grew up on the same Dogman radio song. They've all seen the same internet. They're describing a shared piece of folklore, not a shared animal. The convergence proves the folklore is well known, nothing more. Caleb had heard that objection. The box proves he'd heard it, because he'd argued against it in writing, and his argument is the kind of thing that's annoying precisely because it's not stupid. He pointed out that folklore convergence predicts convergence on the vivid, dramatic, story-worthy elements, the stuff that makes the legend fun to retell. The howl, the red eyes, the chase, and the Dogman folklore does have all of that. But Caleb's witnesses kept converging on the undramatic stuff, the stillness, the smell, the decision, the not hunting. Those elements are bad folklore. They don't make a good campfire story. Nobody embellishes a monster by having it stand quietly and then politely leave. Caleb's argument was that convergence on the boring details is the signature of real shared experience, not shared story, because shared story sands the boring details off, and shared experience doesn't. I don't know if he's right, but I've spent a lot of nights with that argument, and I haven't been able to make it go away. I want to stay with that 1994 logger for a moment, because his is the account in the Michigan folder that Caleb had transcribed most fully, and because of all the secondhand testimony in the box, it's the one I've come closest to being able to picture. The man had been part of a small crew cutting in the Upper Peninsula, deep in, the kind of country where the nearest paved road is a rumor. He'd gone off from the others in the early afternoon, just walking, the way men who work in the woods will walk in the woods even on their own time, and he'd come into a clearing, an old one, grown up with brush, and the thing was standing on the far side of it. His account to Caleb spent almost no time on what the thing looked like. Caleb noted that, and noted that it was typical. The witnesses who convince you are usually the ones least interested in describing the monster. The logger gave it maybe 2 sentences. Tall, dark, upright, a long face. That was all he cared to say about its appearance. What he spent his letter on, what he'd clearly spent 20 years on, was the stillness and the decision. He told Caleb the thing did not move at all, not a twitch. He said he stood at his edge of the clearing, and it stood at its edge, and the only thing in the whole scene that moved was the brush in the wind, and that he had time, real time, long minutes, to look at it and to try every explanation a sane man tries. A stump, a dead snag, a bear up on its hind legs to browse, holding the pose. He tried all of them, the way you'd try keys in a lock, and he told Caleb that the trouble with every one of them was the same. A stump doesn't watch you back. And he knew, the whole time, the way the body knows before the mind will sign off on it, that he was being watched back. And then he said the part Caleb had underlined twice. He said the thing turned its head, slowly, and looked at him directly. And he had the absolute, unshakable sense, he said, that in that moment something was being weighed, that he was being read, the way you'd read a page, and sorted into one of 2 stacks. He said it was the most exposed he had ever felt in his life, more exposed than naked, because it wasn't his body being looked at. It was the whole of him, everything he'd ever done, all of it visible at once to something that had a great deal of practice at looking. And then the thing finished. He could feel it finish. It reached the bottom of the page, and it turned, without any hurry at all, and walked back into the timber, and the wind kept moving the brush, and he was alone, and he had, in his own words to Caleb, passed. Caleb's transcription of the logger's last lines is the thing I'd point to if someone asked me why this box got hold of me the way it has. The logger wrote, "People hear the story, and they ask me if I was scared it would kill me, and I tell them they've got it backwards. I wasn't scared it would kill me. By the end I knew it wasn't going to. I was scared of how it knew not to. A bear doesn't know you. A bear's just weather. This knew me. It stood there, and it knew me, and it made a decision a person makes. And I have spent 20 years being more frightened of that than I ever was of the teeth. Because if it can decide to let you go, then every other time, with every other person, it decided the other way on purpose." Caleb had written beneath that, "He has reasoned his way, alone, in 20 years of turning it over, to the precise thing the Book of the Watchers is about. Not a beast, a will. The horror of the Watchers was never that they were strong. It was that they chose. He does not know he is describing Enoch. That is exactly why I believe him. The rest of the Michigan accounts I'll move through faster, but they thicken the same pattern rather than breaking it. A 1978 sighting from a woman who had been a girl at the time, picking berries, who said the thing watched her from a tree line, and that her dog, a farm dog afraid of nothing, would not go toward it and would not bark, only pressed against her legs and shook. A 2003 account from two brothers, the only sighting in the folder with more than one witness, who agreed on every major point and disagreed, the way real witnesses do. On small ones, one of them sure the encounter lasted a minute and the other sure it was 5. Caleb had noted the disagreement approvingly. Honest witnesses misremember duration. It is the rehearsed accounts that match to the second. And the 2019 account, the most recent in the folder, from a young man, a hiker, who had done the thing Caleb's other witnesses mostly hadn't, which was to tell people, and who wrote to Caleb mostly to describe what telling people had cost him. He said he'd stopped. He said he'd learned to say nothing. He said the silence afterward, the human silence, the friends going quiet and changing the subject, was its own kind of teaching, and that the woods had taught him a creature was real, and the people had taught him to never again say so. Caleb had bracketed that whole letter and written one word beside it, containment. And then, smaller, it is still being done. It is being done by everyone. It is being done at every dinner table where a witness decides it is not worth the cost. The 4th century never ended. The Ohio folder was smaller, 4 witnesses, but it had the single most specific document in the whole correspondence, and it's a document I've held a photograph of and stared at more than any other. One of the Ohio witnesses was a woman, a wildlife rehabilitation volunteer, who had a sighting in 2016 in the Wayne National Forest area, in the southeastern part of the state. And being a wildlife person, she hadn't just written Caleb a description. She'd sent him a drawing, she'd sketched what she saw, and she'd annotated the sketch the way a naturalist annotates a field sketch, with little notes and arrows about proportion and posture. Caleb's interest in that drawing was forensic, and it's so specifically the interest of a documents man that it almost made me laugh when Dale described it. Caleb didn't care that the drawing was scary. He cared about one annotation. The woman had drawn the creature's arms, and she'd noted that the forearms were, proportionally, too long, that the reach was wrong, that if you scaled the thing to a human frame, the arms came down past where a human's arms stop. There's a detail about that drawing that Dale held back until our 5th conversation. And when he finally told me, it changed how I think about the whole Ohio folder. The woman had not sent the drawing with her first letter. She'd sent it later, after Caleb's 3rd or 4th round of careful questions, and she'd sent it with an apology. She wrote that she had hesitated to draw it at all because she was afraid that putting it on paper would make her look like a person who had decided what she saw. A diagnosis dressed up as a sketch, and so, she told Caleb, she had done something deliberate. She had drawn it twice, the first time from memory, fast, the way you describe a face to a police artist. And then she had put that first drawing in a drawer for 2 weeks without looking at it, and at the end of the 2 weeks she had drawn it again, cold, from memory only, refusing to let herself peek at the first one. And then she compared them. She told Caleb she had wanted to know whether her memory was inventing detail or preserving it, whether the thing would drift between the two drawings the way a made-up thing drifts. It didn't drift. That was her whole reason for finally sending them. The two drawings, made 2 weeks apart with no reference between them, matched on the proportions. The same wrong forearm, the same set of the shoulders, the same particular angle of the head. Slightly down and slightly forward, which is the posture every witness in every folder described, and which Caleb had come to think of as the listening posture. Her memory had held the shape steady, and Caleb, in his note clip to those two sketches, wrote something that I think is one of the most quietly rigorous things in the box. She built a control, unprompted, untrained. She designed and ran a memory stability test on her own testimony because she did not trust herself. And she shared the result against her own interest because the result frightened her. This is not how hoaxers behave. Hoaxers do not engineer ways to catch themselves. I would have built that test the same way. I am not sure I would have had the honesty to send it. And Caleb had gone back into the Enochic and related literature, into the descriptions of the Watcher's offspring, and he'd found and clipped into the folder references in that ancient body of text to the giant's disproportion, to limbs and stature that didn't sit right. He wasn't claiming the Ohio woman had read the Book of Giants. He was claiming the opposite. He was claiming she almost certainly hadn't, that no casual person has, and that a wildlife rehabilitator in southeastern Ohio, independently sketching a wrong proportion forelimb and an ancient Aramaic fragment independently describing a wrong proportion hybrid, were two needles that should not be pointing the same direction unless something was actually there for both of them to be describing. There's a follow-up to the Ohio folder that I want to give you, because Caleb gave it real weight, and because it's the kind of thing a man building a fantasy would have left out. The woman, in a later letter, told Caleb that she had gone back. Months after the sighting, in daylight, with a friend and a dog, she had returned to the spot, because she was a wildlife professional and she wanted to do what a wildlife professional does, which is look for sign, tracks, scat, hair on bark, a kill, anything physical. And she found nothing. Not a thing. The ground gave her nothing, the trees gave her nothing, and she wrote to Caleb that the absence had nearly talked her out of her own memory, that standing in an ordinary patch of Ohio woods in the daylight with a cheerful dog and no evidence anywhere, she had felt the sighting start to come loose from her, start to feel like something she'd dreamed. Caleb's response to her, which he kept a copy of, was gentle and, I think, true. He wrote that the absence of physical sign was not evidence against her. He wrote that a creature intelligent enough to assess a human being and decide whether to let it live is, by definition, intelligent enough not to leave a track where a track would matter, and that she should be careful not to let the tidy daylight version of the woods overwrite the version she had actually stood in. He told her, in so many words, not to do to herself what the 4th century had done to the Book of Enoch, not to reclassify her own true thing as unreliable just because the daylight made it inconvenient to keep. The Pennsylvania folder is the one I want to spend a little real time on because it has the witness Caleb corresponded with the longest, and the back and forth between the two of them is, in its own quiet way, the heart of his whole method. The witness was a man Caleb's notes refer to only by initials, which Caleb did consistently for living witnesses, an ethical habit left over from 40 years of handling sensitive estate papers. The man had a sighting in the north-central part of the state, the big timber country up around the Susquehanna headwaters, in the autumn of 2011. He was, by occupation, a deer hunter, a serious one, the kind who spends more nights in the woods than in his own bed during the season, and Caleb noted that this mattered because it meant the witness had a baseline. A casual hiker who sees something strange in the woods has no calibration. A man who has spent 4 decades in the same forest knows precisely what every shape and sound in it is supposed to be, and that man's report that something did not fit carries a different evidentiary weight. What this man described to Caleb was not a chase and not an attack. It was a sound. He'd been in a tree stand well before dawn, and he heard, from a ridge maybe a quarter-mile off, a vocalization. And the reason it stayed with him for the rest of his life, the reason he eventually wrote to a researcher about it a decade later, was that it started as a howl, a recognizable canine howl, the kind of sound he'd heard from coyotes 10,000 times. And then, partway through, it changed. He told Caleb it broke, that the howl broke in the middle, and the second half of it had something in it that a coyote's throat could not make. He reached in his letter for the same thing the other witnesses in the box kept reaching for. He said it sounded like something trying to make a sound its body wasn't built for, trying and getting close and not quite arriving. Caleb's follow-up letters to this man are a small masterclass in not leading a witness. He never once suggested an answer. He asked about wind direction to rule out distortion. He asked whether the man had been able to estimate the height of the sound's origin, because a sound from a creature standing upright comes from higher off the ground than a sound from a creature standing on 4 legs. And an experienced hunter can sometimes tell. He asked whether anything else in the woods reacted, and that last question produced the answer that Caleb circled. The man said that after the sound, everything went silent, that the ordinary pre-dawn woods, which had been full of the small ordinary noises, simply stopped, and that the silence held until well after legal shooting light, so long that the man gave up on the morning and climbed down and went home, because, in his words, the woods felt like they were holding their breath, and he didn't want to be in them while they did it. Caleb had written under that, in the careful pencil he used for his own conclusions rather than his transcriptions, "The silence again. It is in every folder. The creature is reported in perhaps a third of the accounts. The silence is in all of them. I am beginning to think the silence is the more reliable signature. You can mistake a bear for an upright figure in bad light. You cannot mistake the total cessation of birdsong for anything. The woods either make their sound or they do not." The Wisconsin folder had the most aggressive encounter, a 1980s account from the north woods of a creature pacing a pickup truck along a logging road, keeping speed with a moving vehicle on 2 legs, for a stretch the witness estimated at nearly a quarter mile. That account is the one I personally find easiest to disbelieve, and I'll tell you that openly. It strains me, but I'll also tell you, in fairness to the box, that Caleb strained at it too. He had flagged it with a question mark, his own private notation, Dale explained to me, for an account he found compelling in its detail but could not independently corroborate, and he had clipped to it a note that read, "Keep, do not rely on." The witness is consistent across 3 letters and adds no embellishment, which speaks for him. But a single uncorroborated account, however clean, is a fragment, not a foundation. I have spent my life refusing to build on fragments. I will not start now, because the fragment frightens me. I find that note steadying, honestly. It's the note of a man who, even chasing the strangest possible quarry, would not let himself cheat. He kept the standards of his profession all the way down into the dark. Every folder in that box has accounts he set aside, accounts he doubted, accounts he marked as too thin. A man building a fantasy keeps everything. A man doing what Caleb thought he was doing throws things out. But I've been putting off the Iowa folder, and you can probably tell, and the reason I've been putting it off is that the Iowa folder is the one that has Caleb Roan's own name in it. The Iowa folder has 3 witnesses, and the 3rd witness is Caleb. Here's the timeline, reconstructed as best Dale and I can manage from dated documents. In early 2020, Caleb's witness correspondence turned up 2 sighting reports from a single county in northeastern Iowa, in the bluff country near the Mississippi, that broken, wooded, sharply cut terrain that doesn't look like the rest of the state. One report was from 2008, one from 2017. 2 witnesses, no connection to each other, both describing the upright canine figure, both in the same roughly 12-mile stretch of river bluff and hardwood. For Caleb, this was the Michigan pattern showing up in his own backyard, and the box makes very clear that this disturbed him in a way the Michigan material never had. There's a note, dated March 2020, that just says, "It is one thing to study a fire. It is another to smell smoke in your own street." And here is where I have to slow down and be as careful and as fair as I have ever been about anything, because what happens next in the box is a man's mental and physical state declining, and I am not going to pretend I know for certain which parts of that decline were the thing he was investigating and which parts were simply a man in his early 70s approaching the end of his life. Dale won't pretend to know either. Marjorie certainly couldn't. I'm going to give you the documents and the dates, and you are going to have to sit in the discomfort with me, because that's all I've got. There's no clean answer at the bottom of this box. I looked. Through the spring and summer of 2020, Caleb made trips. The box has gas receipts, and it has a county map with pencil markings, and it has what I can only call field notes, which are different in character from everything else in the box. Everything else is an archivist's writing, measured and dated and cross-referenced. The field notes are looser. The handwriting changes across them. They were written outdoors, some of them, you can tell, and some of them were written fast. He went to the bluffs. He walked them. A man who built birdhouses and read Ge'ez drove out to a stretch of Iowa River country and walked the woods looking for the thing the early church had spent 2 centuries trying to make unspeakable. The early field notes are almost mundane. Observations about terrain. He noted, like a surveyor would, like Dale would. The lay of the land, where the deer trails ran, where the bluff faces were too steep to climb. He noted that the area was quiet. He used that word a lot, and at first he just meant it the ordinary way. And then, across the notes, you can watch the word change meaning. By midsummer, quiet stops being a description of a peaceful place and starts being something he's documenting with concern. There's an entry, undated unfortunately, that reads, "Walked the lower trace for 90 minutes. No birds, not few birds, none. I have never been in a deciduous woodland in July with no bird song. Marjorie would not believe me. I almost don't." If you've spent time in the woods, you know exactly how wrong that is. And if you've ever read the wilderness encounter accounts that circulate, you know that the silence, the unnatural absence of ordinary animal sound, is one of the most consistent things witnesses report right before something happens. Caleb knew it too. He'd read it in his own witness folders. The Michigan logger had said it, and here he was writing it down in his own hand about a patch of Iowa. Then there's the smell entry. And the smell entry is the one that made the hair go up on my arms the first time Dale read it to me, because of what it does and doesn't say. Caleb wrote, in an entry he did date, August 9th, 2020, caught it on the high trace near the cut. 40, 50 seconds, then gone. Rot first, that was the top of it, an old rot. But under the rot, the other thing. I have been trying since I got back to the truck to find words for the under thing, and I cannot. And I want to record that I cannot, because every witness in every folder said they could not. And I did not fully believe them. I believed they hadn't tried hard enough. I have now tried hard enough. There are smells the mind will not file. It is not that you lack the word. It is that the thing refuses the category. I owe 11 people in Michigan an apology. I want you to notice what kind of writing that is. That is not a man writing a monster story. That is a careful man having a piece of his own skepticism taken away from him against his will and being honest enough to write down the moment it happened. That entry has no creature in it. It has a smell and a man revising his opinion of his own witnesses. And somehow that's worse. A monster I could argue with, a retired archivist apologizing to his sources because he finally smelled what they smelled that I don't know how to argue with. The field notes get sparser after August. There's a gap of several weeks. Dale thinks, and Marjorie confirmed this much, that Caleb stopped going out for a while in the early fall, that he stayed home and seemed, in Marjorie's word, preoccupied. He spent that stretch back in the documents, and the box shows it, because the fall of 2020 is when the most intense theological notes were written. It's as if, having smelled the smoke in his own street, he went back inside and tried to rebuild the whole argument from the foundation, harder and tighter, like a man checking the locks. And it's in that stretch that he wrote the document that I think is the actual center of the box. Not the most dramatic, the center. It's 4 pages. It's titled, in his hand, Why It Was Worth Removing. And it is Caleb Rohn trying to answer the question he'd first asked Dale over coffee 6 years earlier. Why did the suppression matter so much to the men who carried it out? His answer, compressed, goes like this. He said that the early church faced a genuine and serious problem in the Watcher's material, and that the problem was not that it was embarrassing. He said modern people assume the fathers buried Enoch out of squeamishness, because angels having children was unseemly. Caleb said that was the cover, not the cause. He said the real problem was a problem of jurisdiction. If the Watcher's story is true, then the world contains a category of being that is neither human, nor animal, nor angel, nor demon, but a fourth thing, a hybrid, a bloodline, descended from a crime committed against the order of creation, and still present, and not under anyone's clear authority. Not claimed by heaven, not exactly claimed by hell, just here, persisting in the wild places. And a church that is trying to build a totalizing account of reality, a single map with everything on it and an owner for every square, cannot have a fourth thing wandering around off the map. It cannot have a category of being it has no right for, no doctrine for, no jurisdiction over. Caleb pushed that further than I expected him to, and the way he pushed it is the part of the document I keep rereading. He pointed out that the early church had perfectly good machinery for a demon. You could name a demon, you could rebuke it, you could cast it out. There was a whole liturgy for it. The demon was a defeated enemy, and defeating it again on a Tuesday afternoon was, in a sense, the church doing its job and proving its power. A demon, Caleb wrote, is good for business, but the Watcher's offspring are not a demon. They are not in rebellion against God, and they are not in service to anyone's hell. They are just a consequence, a wrong that was done and then walked off into the hills on its own legs and kept breathing. There is no right for that. You cannot exercise a consequence. You cannot cast out a thing that is not possessing anyone, that is simply, stubbornly, alive at the edge of the firelight, minding a territory and looking back at you. And a being you can neither welcome nor defeat is, for an institution whose entire authority rests on being the one who decides where everything belongs, not a monster. It is something worse than a monster. It is a hole in the map. Caleb's word, and he used it deliberately, knowing its weight, was that the Watcher's bloodline was unadministrable. And his claim was that the church didn't suppress the Book of Enoch because it was false, or even because it was shameful, but because the alternative to suppressing it was admitting, permanently in Scripture, that there was something in the world that the church did not and could not govern. Better, far better, to take the map away. Better to make the fourth thing unspeakable, and let the silence do what doctrine couldn't. And then the last paragraph of why it was worth removing, which Dale read to me very slowly, says this: "If I am right, then the creature in these bluffs is not a demon, and I should stop half expecting it to behave like one. It is not evil. It is not even unnatural, not really. It is only the natural consequence of an unnatural act done long ago. The way a scar is natural. It is a thing that was made, that did not ask to be made, that has outlived everyone who made it, and that has been left to keep to the wild edges of the world with no name it is allowed to be called by. It does not hunt us. My witnesses are unanimous, and I now believe them completely. It watches us. And I have started to wonder if it watches us the way the dispossessed watch the people living in their grandfather's house. I think that's the most haunting thing in the box, and there's not a single monster in it. There's just an old man, alone at his desk, arriving at pity for the thing he went looking for. He went back out. That's the part I have to tell you, and it's nearly the end. In late October of 2020, the field notes resume, and there are only 4 more of them, and they're short. The first just establishes that he's back walking the high trace. The second, dated October 29th, reads in full, "Found a tree on the Cutside Trail, bark stripped in 4 parallel grooves, chest height for me, which is well above chest height for any bear, and there are no bears here regardless. The grooves are clean, deliberate is the wrong word, and I keep reaching for it anyway. I photographed it. That photograph is not in the box. Dale and I have both looked. Marjorie looked. It is the one piece of physical documentation Caleb explicitly says he created, and it is the one piece that is not there. And I have decided to just tell you that plainly rather than smooth it over, because every instinct I have says smoothing it over would be the dishonest thing. I don't know where the photograph is. It may have never come out. It may be in a drawer in that house still. I don't know. The third note is 2 sentences. It let me see it today. I want to be precise. It let me. And that's all that one says. He doesn't describe it. The man who spent 11 years and 200 pages building toward this, when it finally happens, gives it 2 sentences and no description. And I have gone back and forth 100 times on what that means. Part of me thinks he was simply overwhelmed, but the other part of me keeps landing on his own August entry, the one about the smell, where he wrote that there are things the mind will not file, that refuse the category. I think it's possible Caleb didn't describe it because he had finally, fully become one of his own witnesses, the ones who said they couldn't find the words. I think he wrote, "It let me see it," and then sat with his pen over the paper and understood at last completely why 11 people in Michigan had been so frustratingly vague. The 4th and final field note is dated November the 2nd, 2020. Caleb Rohn lived another 2.5 years after he wrote it, lived quietly, by all accounts contentedly, finished out his life with Marjorie and his birdhouses and, Dale says, a kind of settledness that Dale hadn't seen in him in a decade. He never, as far as anyone knows, went back to the bluffs. He more or less stopped adding to the box. The investigation just ended here, with this. And then a man simply went back to his life and stayed in it until his heart stopped in his sleep. The final note says, "I have been thinking about what I came out here believing and what I am taking home. I came believing I would prove a connection, that I would be able to say to Dale, 'Here, look, the sightings in the text are one thing, I was right.' And I suppose I can say that, but it does not feel like being right. It feels like an introduction. It did not threaten me. I want that recorded clearly, because I will not be writing much more, and I do not want to be misremembered. It stood on the cut side of the trace in the last light, and it was exactly what the folders said, and nothing the folders prepared me for, and it was still in the way they all said it would be still, and it looked at me. And I understood, the way you understand a thing in the body before the mind agrees to it, that I was being measured, that it was making a decision about me, the same decision the Michigan logger said it made about him. And I will tell you what I think it was deciding. I think it was deciding whether I was one of the people who took the house or one of the people who only ever wanted to give the family their name back. I think it has gotten very good, over a very long time, at telling those two apart. And I think I was allowed to walk back to my truck because I have spent 11 years trying to return something that was stolen from its kind. Not safety, not a place, just the right to be spoken of, truthfully. Just a name in the record. I am not going to publish any of this. I want to be honest with myself about why. It is not fear, though I was afraid. It is that I finally understand what the 4th century men understood, which is that this knowledge does not sit quietly in a person. It asks something of you. The fathers chose containment. They took the name away to keep the world tidy and governable, and I have spent over a decade despising them for it. But standing on that trace, I understood the temptation of it. There is a peace in the tidy map. I felt the pull of it. The same way, I suspect, my witnesses felt the pull of just never telling anyone. So I will leave the box. I will not destroy it, and I will not publish it. I will leave it for whoever Marjorie trusts to go through my things, and that person can decide, with a clearer head than mine, whether the containment should hold, or whether it is finally time to give the thing in the bluffs, the one thing it has been quietly asking 11 strangers across 40 years to give it, which is to be believed, to be entered back into the record as real. I have made my decision about which kind of person I was. I would like to think it made the same decision about me. The light was almost gone, and it turned, without hurry, and it went back up the cut into the dark, and the birds did not start again for a long while, and I drove home, and Marjorie had kept dinner warm, and I did not tell her, and that, God forgive me, is the containment too. It is so easy. That is the thing nobody warns you about. It is so terribly easy to just not say it. That's the last of Caleb Roan's own words in the box. So now it's mine, and then yours. Dale Hutchins went through the box because Marjorie asked him to, and Dale, the surveyor, the man who doesn't believe in anything he can't establish with a paper trail, sat with it for the better part of a year before he brought it to me. And I asked him, the last time we spoke, the obvious question. I asked him what he thought it was, the whole thing. Caleb's 11 years, and Dale said, and I'm giving you this close to word for word because I wrote it down the second we hung up. He said, I keep wanting to tell you it was a good man getting old. That's the safe survey. The lines close, everybody goes home. But I knew Caleb 40 years, and I'll tell you the problem with the safe survey. A man getting old and confused gets confused. His notes would get worse, wronger, sloppier, and that's not what the box does. The box gets sharper. The argument gets tighter. The deeper in he goes, right up to the end, that August entry about the smell, where he apologizes to his own witnesses, you don't write that going senile. You write that the other way. You write that getting unfooled. And I've surveyed a lot of ground, and the one thing I know is when somebody hands you a parcel and the lines actually close, you can feel it, it sits right. This one closes. That's what I can't get past. I checked his work the way I'd check a junior man's plat, and the lines close. I just don't like where they close. I've checked, too, the parts a person can check. The dating of the Book of Enoch to the 3rd and 2nd centuries before Christ, real, mainstream, confirmed by the Qumran fragments. The Book of Enoch being quoted as prophecy in the Epistle of Jude, real. It's in everyone's Bible right now. Go look. Tertullian defending the Book of Enoch by name, real. The book being pushed out of the Western canon over the 4th and 5th centuries and surviving complete only in Ge'ez in the Ethiopian church. Real, all of it, none of it fringe. The Book of Giants among the Dead Sea Scrolls, real. The theological motive for the suppression, the discomfort with angelic hybridity, and the pivot to the safe sons of Seth. Reading of Genesis 6, real and openly discussed by scholars. Every load-bearing historical claim in Caleb Roan's box checks out. That's not the part in question. That was never the part in question. The part in question is the bluffs. And I'll be straight with you the way Caleb tried to be straight with himself. I cannot verify the bluffs. I can't verify a smell that refuses the category, or a woods with no birds, or 4 clean grooves at the wrong height, or 2 sentences that say, "It let me see it," and then stop. The one photograph that might have been physical evidence is not in the box, and I've told you that, and I'm not going to dress it up. What I can tell you is that I have the box now. Dale gave it to me. He gave it to me because Caleb's last note said the box should go to whoever Marjorie trusts, and Marjorie trusted Dale. And Dale, after a year, decided he was not the right final reader, that he was too much the surveyor and not enough the other thing, and he passed it to me. Which means the decision Caleb left in that note, the actual decision, the containment or the record, has come down the line, and it's sitting on my desk, and it has, whether I like it or not, become mine, and I've made it. You understand that by now. You've been listening to me make it. All of this, everything I've just told you, is me declining to do what the 4th century men did. It's me declining to do what Caleb himself, by his own confession, did when he drove home and let Marjorie keep dinner warm and said nothing. He called that silence the real containment, the easy kind, the kind nobody warns you about. So I'm not keeping it quiet, I'm entering it into the record. A retired archivist named Caleb Roan spent the last 11 years of his life building a case that an ancient text, treated as scripture by the earliest Christians, and then deliberately removed from the Bible by a church that could not tolerate what it described, was an accurate account of a hybrid bloodline that did not end with the flood, that persists in the wild margins of the world, that is witnessed in our own time by people who have no framework left to understand what they're seeing, and that does not hunt us. That watches us. That has been reduced over 16 centuries of enforced silence to standing very still at the edges of the forest, hoping, in whatever way a thing like that can hope, that one of the people it watches will finally do the one thing the church made unspeakable and say out loud that it's real. I don't know if Caleb was right. I want to say that one more time, plainly because he'd want me to. I don't know. The historical half of his box is unanswerable, and the other half is 2 sentences and a smell and a missing photograph and the testimony of a man I never met. That's not proof. I'm not going to insult you by calling it proof, but I'll tell you the thing I keep coming back to, the way Caleb kept coming back to 4 words in a margin. The early church did not argue that the Book of Enoch was false. That's the detail that won't leave me alone. They argued it could not be allowed to be true. And those, like Caleb wrote, are 2 completely different acts. You expend that kind of effort across that many decades against a book, you don't do that to a lie. A lie you just let fall over on its own. You only build a containment that elaborate around something you're afraid is accurate. So here's where I'll leave it, and then it's yours. Because Caleb's note said, the reader decides, and you're the reader now too. If you spend time in the deep woods, the real ones, the upper Midwest, the Appalachian hollows, the North Woods, and you find yourself somewhere the birds have gone quiet. All of them. Not few, but none. And you catch on the air something rotten with something else underneath it that your mind will not file, that refuses to become a word. Then understand what Caleb came to understand on that trace in the last light. You are almost certainly not in danger. That is what every witness in that box, across 40 years and 4 states, was finally trying to tell him, and what he drove out to the bluffs and confirmed with his own lungs and his own eyes. It does not hunt, it watches, it measures. It is deciding which kind of person you are. And if you're ever the one being measured, standing still in a silent wood, while something at the tree line that the church spent 2 centuries making unspeakable looks at you and makes up its mind, I think the only thing you can do, the only thing that's ever worked, is the thing Caleb did. Be the kind of person who wants to give the name back. Don't be one of the ones who took the house. And then, when you get home, and dinner's warm, and it would be so easy, so terribly easy, to just never say it. Say it anyway.